Okay. Well, good morning and a very warm welcome to everybody, to the most courageous of us who are here, even in the middle of a bank holiday, to continue participating in our seminar series here at MIDIB, at the MIDIB network. Today's webinar is devoted to ethnic minorities in the UK housing system. And it's been organized by David Fay, a good old friend of ours and my very own colleague at the Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. So thanks a lot for organizing this session, David. I'm going to introduce briefly the three speakers. Each speaker will speak in turn, as is usually the practice at MIDIB, and then we will be able to take questions from the floor. The first speaker is Alex Marsh. Alex is a professor of public policy at the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. He's done a lot of work over the last 30 years on various aspects of social and private rented housing in the UK. And he is currently governance theme lead for the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. He's involved in other projects as well, in a variety of other projects, in particular one in collaboration with Suzanne Fitzpatrick at Heriot-Watt University at Edinburgh, and the homeless charity Crisis, looking at social housing allocations policy in Britain. Our second speaker is David Robinson, Professor of Housing and Urban Studies in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield. His research is centered on exposing and understanding inequalities in access to the benefits of decent, secure and affordable housing within the UK housing system. And he's also currently directing a project exploring policy and practice understandings and responses to ethnic inequalities in the housing systems of England, Scotland, and Wales. And our third speaker is the above-mentioned David Fay from the Sorbonne Nouvelle, Professor of British Studies here at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, who's also currently the head of the Research Centre on Contemporary Britain here. So technically my boss. David specializes in the study of housing and urban policies in the UK against the background of the evolution of the British welfare state. Has authored many articles and books and edited volumes on the subject. His latest edited volume is about the new towns in France and Britain. It's called Paradise Lost, Lessons from the French and British New Towns. So again, Vincent and I, as co-organizers of the MIDIB Research Network, are thankful to David for organizing this, thankful to the three participants, including David, for speaking to us today. And I think we can start straight away, unless David, you want to add a word, but we can start straight away with the presentation by our first speaker, Alex Marsh.
Sorry, yes, so, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mention I've prepared a very short, fairly short introduction to set the scene before Alex speaks. So perhaps I should turn with it. So thank you very much, Romain and Vincent, for suggesting I should organize a seminar on housing and ethnic minorities. Thank you also, obviously, to Alex and to David for agreeing to participate in this webinar. And as I hope our three presentations will demonstrate, housing plays a key role in shaping the lives of ethnic minorities in the UK. So I'm really, really glad we've organized a webinar on this topic. So as I said before, handing to Alex, I would like to begin with a very brief reminder and a short introduction about the relationship of between race and ethnicity and housing in the UK, and in particular in the academic literature. So this is obviously not going to be a literature. It's meant to be an attempt to set the scene to our three presentations. And I think it would be impossible to start, to start the webinar and to start this introduction without referring to a seminal work, John Rex and Robert Moore's book that you've probably come across or heard about, Race, Community and Conflicts, published in 1967. In the book, the first one, I think, to address the issue of race and housing, the authors set out to study race relations in Birmingham. And in doing so, they brought to the fore the issue of racial discrimination in housing. The book is an ethnographic study of one neighborhood of Birmingham, Sparbrook, and of the consequences of the housing shortage at the time on the residents. And the book is famous for categorizing the residents of that district into 5 housing classes, as the authors called them. 1967 also marked the publication of a number of investigations into the housing strategies of Black immigrants in the UK. And I'm thinking in particular of E. Burney's A Study of Immigrants and Local Government. And I think since the late 1960s, the study of housing in relation to ethnic minorities has led to a vast literature, as I said before, and that several strands, I believe, of research can be made out, and several strands of research have emerged. The first one addresses the question of access to housing by ethnic minorities, and as a consequence, spatial and tenure segregation, and in particular, the question of housing allocations in the housing system. And I think Alex will tell us more about this in a minute. The creation of a Commission for Racial Equality in 1976 to replace the former Race Relations Board led to a stream of reports, as you probably know, into the practices of local authorities regarding housing. One of these was the seminal report, Race and Council Housing in Hackney, published in 1984. That followed a 6-year inquiry by the Commission for Racial Equality into the allocation procedures and policies in Hackney. And the report highlighted the degree of institutional racism in the borough, the flawed allocation policies, and the unmet needs of ethnic households. And this report was followed by more reports, obviously, and similar conclusions in other boroughs. And over the years, academic research highlighted similar problems in the voluntary sector, in the private rented sector, and in the owner-occupied sector in relation to estate agencies. So in relation to selling practices. Later on, from the late 1990s onwards, a number of publications have looked at race and housing from a perspective of social exclusion. And I'm thinking, for instance, about a special issue of housing studies published in 1998, devoted to the social exclusion perspective on housing studies. Or I'm also thinking of a book by Peter Somerville, published in 2002, Race, Housing and Social Exclusion. And all these academic pieces of research looked at choice, in particular choice and constraints, to explain the housing patterns of ethnic minorities. A second strand of research has focused on ethnic minorities' housing conditions. This has been made possible, as you all know, by the collection of ethnic statistics from the 1970s onwards, and in particular after 1991, the introduction of ethnic categories in the census. And all the many studies into ethnic housing conditions feature the Commission for Racial Equality's reports I mentioned previously, as well as official surveys like the English Housing Survey based on the census, and a number, obviously, of books and chapters such as Race in Britain Today, published in 1992 by Skeffington, or more recently, Burns' Ethnicity, Race and Inequality in the UK. And what's interesting, I think, is that the more recent publications underline, I'm quoting here, the relative neglect of attention given to ethnic minorities in housing research in recent decades. Or to quote another book, race and ethnicity are marginalized from housing debates. So this is the question that David Robinson will address later on. And to finish, finally, I think the relationship between race or ethnic minorities and housing has also been approached from a perspective of actors, stakeholders in the housing system. And I'm thinking here about books like Alan Murray's Moving Homes that charts the history of a housing corporation, the defunct body in charge of funding housing associations. Or again, Peter Malpus, Housing Associations and Housing Policy, and other books, obviously. So they've all devoted a number of pages and chapters to the, in particular, BME, housing associations. Some journal articles have also focused on the history of the BME sector, its institutional position, its achievements. But as I will try to explain later on, apart from a fairly recent or very recent journal article published in 2019 by Stott and Favor entitled Challenging Racialized Institutions, or a book by Gulliver and Prentice in 2015, these are fairly old. And I'm thinking here about books by David Mullins or Harrison. I will be attempting later on to provide more recent information in my presentation about the BME housing sector. Right, I think I should hand over to Alex, and I hope this brief and very broad overlook will have provided you with some background information to understand the next presentations. So thank you very much, and over to you, Alex.
Very much, David. I was very much caught there in your comments by the term relative neglect of these topics. I think one of the things that came across quite forcefully in that presentation was, I think, I might be wrong, but I think every one of the colleagues that you mentioned there as contributing to this literature is now retired. So in terms of the attention to which this topic sort of attracts is, I mean, I think it's part of the story of today, I think, really. So what I want to talk about today is current developments in accessing social housing specifically, and their implications for ethnic minority households. And I think that's a story partly of some big unanswered questions, as much as it is as providing answers, because I think that story of relative neglect has continued in terms of ability to map, and some of those landmark studies that involve sort of deep ethnography within departments. You know, there hasn't been a study of that type for quite a while, sort of getting to grips with the sort of processes in the institutions that shape the system. So what I want to talk about quite quickly is to frame things quite broadly, to look at the context in which social housing operates, the sort of structural transformations that social housing has undergone, because a lot of that sort of path-breaking literature was about local authority housing and local authority bureaucratic process, you know, and that is not how the system really works in large part anymore. And what we're currently witnessing, and I think there's a wide recognition in policy practice and academia that there's an issue. We're currently witnessing the way in which long-standing trends and pressures that have been building up in the system are intersecting with sort of newer imperatives and constraints on the way that social housing organizations operate. But importantly, it's only partly a housing story. And, you know, and I think that's a key part of the picture. So what I want to do is sort of just quickly overview some ingredients of the story, that the forces bearing in on the system, something about what that implies by way of allocations and access policy and practice, and then some brief reflections on the implications for minority ethnic households. And there are several projects that are sort of underway trying to grapple with this, to address the evidence gap at the moment around what's happening with minority ethnic households and access, but they're ongoing, and at the moment they're relatively early stages. So I've got four things that I want to really touch on about the context and to explain what's happening at the moment and why it's sort of different to some of that classic literature. So the first one of those is around privatization and financialization. So we're familiar with, if you're familiar with the UK housing system, you'll be familiar with the right to buy and the sell-off of council housing. That's reducing the number of lettings. Now I think that's one important part of the story, because one of the key background facts, if you like, is the reducing the number of lettings that are available, and therefore the increased competition for access to social housing. And over the last 10, 20 years, the number of lettings per annum in England particularly is about a third now of what it was 20 years ago. So there's been a significant reduction in the availability of social housing. Partly that's about right to buy. I think for my story today, equally important is the policy of stock transfer. That is, local authorities selling off their housing and redesignating it as housing association, not-for-profit, civil society, charitable organizations. So in England, about half of local authorities don't have any housing stock anymore. If you go back to the 70s, they all had housing stock. Now about half of them don't have housing stock, and all the stock in the area is owned by housing organizations that are in the voluntary or third sector. And those organizations, that's partly about a pursuit of a mixed economy of welfare. So there was in the 80s and the 90s, there was the idea that actually, a local authority monopoly was a bad thing. We need alternative providers. We need to create different source, a mixed supply of housing. But alongside that, and I think more importantly, again, for what's happening now, was the idea that it shouldn't all be publicly funded. So in the 70s, social housing was funded by a mix of grant and subsidy from the public sector. The public grant was retained. The loans were switched to being private, and then over time, the proportion of public funding reduces, the proportion of private funding increases. So organisations that are voluntary, not-for-profit, that are committed to providing social housing are quite often, if they've built new houses over the last 30 years, have got a chunk of private funding. Initially, that was just bank lending, but it's become increasingly exotic over time. Private bond placements, private equity, sovereign wealth funds, these are all contributing to some part of funding social housing in different parts of the country and to different degrees. So there's a much more complex picture of and a much more complex pattern of incentives for providers in the housing association sector, particularly the big national providers in England. And these are very, very big and very, very, very highly leveraged in some cases organizations. So the second factor is what I've called the waxing and waning of liberalization and responsibilization. So in the 2000s, from 2001 onwards up to 2010, we were in the era of choice and responsibility in public services, which fed into housing with the introduction from the Netherlands of choice-based lettings schemes. So rather than officer-driven, bureaucratically driven allocation systems where it was the supplier that, if you like, decided which properties to offer to which households, which was part of the problem identified by David in terms of those gatekeeping roles and sort of officers directing certain ethnic minority households to particular type of the stock, parts of the stock, and maybe the less good quality property. Choice-based lettings was trying to remove some of that frontline discretion and make letting systems more transparent, but put more responsibility on the applicants to exercise agency, to bid for properties, to indicate which properties they were interested in. If they didn't bid, they didn't get anything, and it was sort of trying to sort of replicate a sort of consumerist type idea in the public sector or in the social rented sector alongside the private sector. So in the 2000s, that sort of spread across the country. It was also an era of harmonizing practices and policies. So the idea that each housing organization shouldn't maintain a different set of criteria for allocation. We should try and harmonize as far as possible. So if you lived in a particular city, all of the landlords would sign up to the same sort of allocation system, the same sorts of policies if possible, and that would make it easier for the households looking for housing to sort of decide between the various. So in the city of Bristol, where I am, we've got the local authority and 18 housing associations that all work through the same system now, and as far as possible, they sort of started out harmonizing policy to make that easier. And it was an era of open lists. So in the old days, there was a gatekeeping role of who got onto the housing register for social housing. And then that was, again, an area where there was questions of discrimination and who got on or who didn't get onto the list. From 2002 onwards, the idea that you could gatekeep the list was abolished, and anybody could register if they wanted to. So lists sort of expanded, including people with no obvious housing need, but they could register if they wanted to. This is an era of a different flavor, if you like, to the system. But over time, there's been big questions about whether the idea of choice in choice-based lettings is meaningful. If you've got only a small number of properties and a shrinking number of properties and an expanding number of people on the list looking for, what does that mean in terms of who's actually got choice? And are a number of these people not got choice? So our household's going to just sit there for years and years and years and with no chance of ever benefiting from rehousing. and also whether it's effective from a housing management point of view. So there's a sort of consumer perspective, but also a provider perspective. Does this system become unwieldy? Does it waste a lot of time with a lot of people in the system that are never going to be have no hope of being rehoused? And where we are at the moment is lots of local authority areas still have choice-based letting system, so the form is still there, but the content has changed over time. So gradually we're getting supplementary rules being applied and systems being managed in slightly different ways. So if you like, the idea that the tenant or the applicant is responsible for meeting their housing needs through a system is we're returning to some element of bureaucratic management to some of these things in sort of for the purposes of more effective housing management, to allocate households to stock which is maybe less popular, etc. So some of the characteristics of the predecessor systems, in my view, sort of re-emerge over time. So the third thing is the balance between household and community. So our system is based on allocation, or at least the rhetoric of it is allocation on the basis of the need in the light of reasonable preference. So certain sorts of households have to be given reasonable preference. So one of the things that in the literature that David was referring to earlier on was whether ethnic minority households actually were being accorded appropriate preference within the system. So they came to the front of the queue and they got access to housing, or were certain sorts of claims to needs being denied. As the number of lettings has reduced over time, the proportion of people with reasonable preference might be statutorily homeless, for example, and typically are in high demand areas, take up a bigger and bigger proportion of the lettings. So we end up with concentrations of people with potentially complex needs in the available stock, and that's led to concern in the housing management field about the housing management challenges that are raised as a consequence. So since the 2000s, we've had a rhetoric of balanced and stable communities alongside that. So not just a household and their needs, but how do we sustain communities that are functional and successful? And how does that sit alongside allocation on the basis of need and high social need? And how do those two things reconciled? So there's increasing emphasis on overriding exclusively needs-driven systems. So actually we can't keep allocating simply on the basis of the people with the highest needs, because that leads to a social housing system which is concentrating poverty, disadvantage, and all sorts of problems. So we ought to be able to sort of leaven the mix a bit with allocating to people who are in work, who have got stable lives, who don't have obviously identifiable problems, in order to make sustainable communities. So trying to conversation, and what does that imply for the term sustainable and sustainable communities is one which lacks any specific definition. And the idea of a balanced and successful community is one we could debate for the rest of today, because there are lots of ways of getting to there. And equally, there are not any very clear recipes and formulas and levers to pull to guarantee that you deliver such a thing. So it opens up a space for debate and discretion about who should have priority in housing systems. Use for example, a very ethnically homogenous system, a very ethnically homogenous community could be seen as sustainable, but it could also be seen as highly exclusionary. So so things like local lettings policies would be part of that story as well. So the idea that we shouldn't have an open system, we should have tailored lettings policies for particular communities to deliver sustainable communities in that neighborhood. And that can be a sort of code for thinking about insiders and outsiders, exclusion and inclusion. And as part of this, we've also seen the revalidation of what we used to call acceptability. In the system before the 1960s, there was a lot of emphasis on things like the housing visitor coming round to a potential resident of social housing, and the housing visitor would assess their housekeeping standards. Do they keep their house tidy? Do they keep it clean? Are they somebody who can be trusted with a social rented property? And of course that led to a set of norms being applied to households, and certain people being excluded for a range of reasons which are sort of independent of how much they needed better accommodation. In the 60s, that was squeezed out, and the emphasis was on objective assessments of need. And it seems to me, reading some of the commentary, we don't have systematic research on it yet, but reading some of the commentary and some of the sort of stakeholder reflections and sort of some of the expert commentary, some of these issues of acceptability are re-emerging now. When we talk about balanced and sustainable communities, when we talk about a limited number of tenancies and the need to ensure that the housing management costs are minimized, acceptability is back on back on the table. Lettings officers, deciding whether or not households can be trusted to look after the property has come back onto the agenda in a significant way. My fourth point is austerity politics and austerity policy, because understanding what's happening in relation to social housing and access to social housing is fundamentally about the bigger picture in terms of public finance. And there's three elements to that I think are important. The first one is cuts to local authority revenue budgets. So the austerity post the global financial crisis, post 2010, that the UK public sector has experienced, and in my view, has been a pretext for the next instalment of the ongoing tension between central and local government. So actually, quite a lot of the budget cuts that have been sought by central government as a consequence of the global financial crisis have been cutting local authority budgets, and not just housing budgets, but budgets for providing adult social care, for providing tenancy support services, tenancy sustainment services, providing antisocial behaviour management and housing management at the neighbourhood levels. All these are things which have been cut as a consequence of the broader cut in local authority funding. So there's a whole bunch of things there that are sort of allied to housing and the housing system that are important for the way the system used to function, that are important for the feasibility of certain sorts of allocation strategies, in terms of how one manages and sustains neighbourhoods. And therefore, if these allied services aren't available, what sorts of allocations policy makes sense? So there's that set of cuts, which are biting really hard on local authorities, really, really hard in many cases. I mean, the other thing that's emerged in the UK system, if you're not familiar with it, you maybe forgive me if you are, is that it is highly partisan as well. The way in which the cuts have landed are highly partisan, in the sense that they are, affecting local authorities that are of a different political complexion to the government, primarily, partly because they're urban, but also partly because of the politics of it. The second of the three strands is welfare reform or social security reform. Again, under the auspices of austerity, the government has made significant changes to the social security system, all of which are about making it less generous. The reform, the universal credit reform, which took 6 benefits and brought them into 1 benefit, which some might argue in the abstract is a good idea. In reality, has been about making it less generous. More importantly for this story, I think, is the benefit cap and the restrictions on the housing components, and the maximum amount that you can claim to assist with housing, but also the maximum that you can claim overall. That was introduced. That's been a 2-stage process. The principle of a cap rather than an open-ended benefit system geared towards need was introduced with a relatively generous cap to start with that didn't affect many people, and that actually eased its passage through Parliament. They said, well, actually, okay, we can have a cap at this level because really not many people are affected, but it puts a lid on the sort of most extreme cases. And actually, if you analyze the political discourse about the most extreme cases, there was a strong minority ethnic component to the story of, large families living in expensive accommodation, big houses in expensive accommodation. And this is the sort of thing we need the benefit system to stop, even though there are very, very few of those actual cases in the system. But in 2016-17, that benefit cap was reduced quite substantially, and it now means that social security benefits struggle to keep up, or indeed they don't keep up with the housing costs in particular places. And within that, again, with a sort of, for our story, an important part of the system is the removal of the higher levels, bigger, the benefit to assist you with occupying larger properties has also been removed. And then finally, affordable rents. That is the idea that rather than charge social rents, which are maybe half of market rents in the private rented sector, you could charge rents that were up to 80%. So basically, social housing got more expensive. So those are the 4 things. So the net effect of these, I've identified half a dozen things. We've got an overriding shortage in many, but not all localities. Fewer lettings. We've got divergent organizational objectives. So you've got the local authority, which has got statutory obligations to run an allocation scheme and house people in need, but often they're reliant on other organizations to actually provide the accommodation. And in some cases, they're entirely reliant. And those other organizations have got a set of other objectives. They've got a set of other stakeholders. They've got a set of private finance, for example, in the background, flows of income that they have to satisfy. They've got credit rating agencies in some cases that they have to keep satisfied. So there's a whole bunch of other things that factor into that. And their primary income stream is rents. So they've got to make sure that the rent is going to be paid. And that militates against housing people where there's a risk associated with that. So inter-organizational relations have been really important in this now, to try and work out how local schemes operate, how local authorities work with other organizations, particularly in stock transfer areas, particularly how they use their rights to nominate to housing associations. Supplementary letting criteria applied by housing associations and things like affordability checks have become a big bone of contention. So we're now in a situation where pre-tenancy applicants have to be affordability checked, and in some cases those affordability checks lead to the applicant being rejected for social housing. They'll say, well, you can't afford social housing, particularly you can't afford social housing at affordable rents, because these are rents that you know the benefit system doesn't actually allow you to pay. So what we've got overall, you might summarize as saying we've got a system which is nominally needs-based, but actually is moving much more towards a risk-based allocation system for social housing. And those are financial risks. Can the landlord afford to take on a particular household? Can they be sure they're going to be able to pay the rent? But also management risks. Are they going to be trouble? Are they going to destabilize the neighborhood? Or if they're as a household not going to be a problematic household in terms of their own household behavior, is their presence within a particular neighborhood going to generate tensions of particular types? So again, you've got a housing management strand to that. And sometimes that's rationalized as sort of in the household's interest. You know, we don't want to set households up to fail by giving them a tenancy they can't sustain, but sometimes that may well be a pretext for a broader set of institutional considerations. So just to reflect on the implications of that for Black and minority ethnic households. We actually don't know a lot about how these various things combine, and the project we're doing is trying to get to local case studies to work out how these different tensions are being reconciled by groups of an ecology of organization within particular localities, but we haven't got as far as that in our project yet. But we can see that things like the use of local connection criteria to manage the list, that is, you can only join the list for social housing if you've lived in a particular area for 2, 3, 4, 5 in cases years, clearly has an exclusionary potential for migrants. I mean, it went away during the era of openness. It's back again very clearly and very firmly in the system. Things like sustainable communities, local lettings, acceptability, all bring with them presumptions about insiders and outsiders, acceptable and particular norms, which don't necessarily work to the disadvantage of Black and minority ethnic communities, but on the other hand, we know that they have the potential to, and that there are examples of anecdotal evidence that they do. But how systematically that plays out is an interesting and challenging question. We know that in the era of choice, minority ethnic households, rather than, if you like, becoming able to choose to live in other parts of the city where they were precluded from under the gatekeeping model of bureaucratic allocation, they were just as concentrated in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. So there was an element of self-constraint or self-selection into poorer housing, even with choice. And now we're going back to bureaucratic allocation. Households with precarious work, households who are reliant on social assistance to secure and sustain accommodation, are those that are seen as most risky by the system at the moment. If you're definitely on benefit and out of the labour market, well, that's got some stability to it. If you're in work, you're seen as less risky. If you're on the margins, if you're economically active but in a precarious position on the edges of the labour market, if you like, and therefore you're interacting with the benefit system in ways that keep changing, that's the bit that's if you like, the most risky from the landlord's point of view. And that might butt up against, you might have housing need, but how's that weighed against risk? And that applies to some minority ethnic groups, but maybe not all. Younger single people, large families, areas of high housing costs. These are all criteria that mean that social assistance no longer provides sufficiently to secure adequate accommodation or adequate independent accommodation. And these are characteristics that affect ethnic minority households to differing degrees, and obviously from different communities. But there is concern that the system as it is geared up now is such that there are certain groups that, if you like, can't afford social housing, can't afford, and landlords that can't provide accommodation that would be culturally appropriate for particular groups, because the funding mechanisms and the social security system, puts it out of reach of a particular types of household. And they're defaulting to the private rented sector in some cases, but the private rented sector is a poor alternative in terms of quality, and something that David may or may not say more about, I know some work on it, but we've also got the sort of hostile environment, right to rent rhetoric about the ability to reside in the UK, which has been strengthened over the last few years. And that's become an exclusion mechanism in the private rented sector. Private landlords use it as a screening device. Do you look like you? There might be an issue here. Am I at risk of? Because the liability falls straight onto the landlord. You know, if you accidentally accommodate somebody, you know, you shouldn't have because they're not supposed to be living in the country. You know, you've got a criminal liability. So it's just easier if you like to screen out certain sectors of the population. So private renting is a challenge if social housing is denied. So I'll just finish on one observation, and that is a fifth factor, which is the COVID disruption. So it strikes me that we haven't really been able to explore this yet because this is the future, if you like. The COVID disruption is, and particularly the everybody in policy that basically got rough sleepers off the street within a matter of weeks and accommodated them for a period of months. To me, what that did is it demonstrated what is possible with concerted and coordinated efforts. And that certainly affected some minority ethnic groups disproportionately. And as a byproduct of that, it has sort of demonstrated that some of the constraints the system has operated under are self-imposed. They're political. They are matters of choice, and the system could be ordered differently. The question is that a temporary aberration, or does that open up the window of opportunity for advocates, for campaigners, for changing, for an opportunity for policy change? To me, it was quite striking that the other day, Michael Gove, in front of a select committee in the UK Parliament, who's the current minister for the Conservative government, was asked whether he saw social housing as part of the solution to the problem, and he said, roughly speaking, of course it is. Which is for a Conservative minister to be even neutral, I think, about social housing, let alone broadly positive, was just an interesting little snippet of how if you're optimistic about how the way the policy conversation about housing is evolving, my sense is we're getting to a point where current systems might well fall over because they're unsustainable. So the question is, where do we go next, and have we got the arguments to reform, if you like, to reformulate the way some of these directions? But that may just be being overly optimistic. So I'll stop there.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this very stimulating presentation. I'm sure we've learned a lot of things, and certainly we'll have a number of questions to ask you afterwards. So David, shall we just move on to the next speaker? Yeah. So over to you, David, then. David Robinson.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. I've got some slides, so I'll try and share my screen. And if somebody could tell me if it's not working, that would be helpful. So here we go, fingers crossed. Oh, host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, so I'll allow you.
Thank you.
I haven't disabled anything actually, but so permet. Hang on a second. Yeah, that should do the trick.
Yeah.
Now co-host, right? So it should.
Thank you.
Should work. Yes.
Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so you can see my presentation.
Indeed.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to look backwards and reflect on where we are and look forwards a little bit around ethnic inequalities in housing, principally focusing on England, because as you'll be aware, post-devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has been increasing divergence in housing policy, which in part reflects the different political cultures in the different nations of the UK. So I'm going to focus mostly on England. David helpfully provided an excellent introduction, which covered the first half of my talk, so I'm able to skip through some of that, which is great, and allows me to focus more on the more contemporary issues. But I think one of the things, thinking through some of the points that David was making, there's not a lot that's good about getting older. But one of the benefits is that you're able to take a long view, reflecting often on personal experience. And I had the good fortune in the early parts of my sort of academic career in the 1990s to work with many of the names that David read out. His introduction to issues around race and ethnicity and housing in the UK context. Many of these people their academic careers had started in the 1960s or the 1970s, and they were very much orientated towards the kind of traditions of the civil rights movement and challenging racism in the housing system. And so being at events with people like Valerie Kahn or Wrexham Moore, actually being at events where they were talking, Robert Moore, I remember him talking at an event in Birmingham, or working with people like Malcolm Harrison or Deborah Phillips, who very much, they were a kind of cohort of people who often had done their PhDs at a very similar time and all knew each other and were cross-fertilizing ideas and doing some really important, fascinating work. And I was sort of at the tail end of a lot of their careers and did little bits of work with them. And now I'm able to sort of look back over the last sort of 20 or more years while I've been researching around this kind of subject and reflect upon the changes a little bit. So I'll be doing that a lot in what I'm going to talk through today. I guess there's two sections, if you like, to my presentation. One is just looking backwards and reflecting on where we were in the 1960s and the kind of advancements that were made in terms of rendering the problems of racism and the ethnic inequalities associated with those in the housing system, rendering those visible through the sort of grassroots activism, but also the kind of research and analysis. And then the sense that was something resembling a slow march towards greater equality by challenging those inequalities in the context of a liberal welfare state that sought to promote social citizenship rights. And I'm not suggesting it was ideal and that equality was reached, but there was a sense of progress, there was a sense of improvement, and there was a kind of sense of consciousness of those issues and challenges when reflections were being made about the legal frameworks, about regulatory frameworks and stakeholder responsibilities, and challenging where practice wasn't living up to some notion or ideal or standard. And then I'll move on and reflect a little bit about where I think we are now and the way that we still have ethnic inequalities in housing, but as both Alex and David have alluded to already, to a certain extent, those are rendered increasingly invisible in discussion and debate, both popular and political, around housing issues. And then posing a question, I guess, which is, is therefore progress toward equality and ethnic equality in housing opportunities and possibilities faltering in the context of the neoliberal state. And that kind of builds to a crescendo, which then dies, and I will end up saying, and we're doing some research on this, and I don't have the answers at this point in time. So that's where I'll end. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about the period from the 1960s, where there was recognition of entrenched inequalities in the English housing system, but they were increasingly rendered visible and challenged through activism and evidence, through legislation, through regulation, through policy innovation, within the context of a liberal welfare state. So that's the story that I'm just going to briefly reflect upon in a few slides. David usefully went back to Wrexham Moore, this key study in Sparkbrook in the mid-1960s, which was published in 1967. And I think this was a fundamental text in that it sort of set the tone and directed the discussion and debate, particularly in particularly in academic circles around issues of discrimination and disadvantage and racism in English housing. It was based in Birmingham. A central idea within the book was that working class migrants and working class white British settled residents had distinct and different experiences when it came to housing. And the way that they sought to explain that was that the migrant or minority ethnic households had a different series of constraints placed upon them, principally because of discrimination. And on that basis, they identified that group as a distinct housing class from other working class households, white British working class households. So it was recognizing that distinctiveness of the experience that was rooted in more than just choice or cultural preference, which was often a referenced kind of explanation for these inequalities was that people were choosing particular situations, locations and housing forms, and challenged that notion, suggested it was also about the constraints upon their consumption practices. So I think two things that I think came out of Wrexham that were really important. One is the notion that housing was a key sort of space within which there was racial conflict within England. And so this discussion in 1960s Birmingham about 30,000 people on the local authority waiting list was increasingly problematized in local political and popular debate as being about migration, because the new migrants were coming in increasing demand. And that was the key problem. What Wrexham found in their study was that actually it was far more complex, and they found no evidence that migration was actually, through the numbers of people arriving, had made the housing situation worse. What was typically happening was that the new migrants in 1960s Birmingham, and one can say this for many other cities, were actually filling spaces in the housing system locally that had been left behind by people who had more choice to exercise, typically in poor quality private accommodation in city centres, often living in houses in multiple occupation. And they were moving into those spaces in part because of the resources and income that they had didn't allow them to exercise access to home ownership, but also because of discriminatory practices of key stakeholders, including, as Alex has already been talking about, public landlords, principally councils at that point in time, but also practices within the private rented sector. So migrant households working with choices within, exercising choice within a greater system of constraint than other housing classes. And this housing conflict model and that notion of migrant housing experiences, as we'll go on in the talk, you'll see resonate very much still with the contemporary issues and challenges in the English housing system for minority ethnic households. So the text didn't go uncriticised. There was quite a lot of discussion and debate about the idea of housing class and the extent to which it was neglecting or failing to foreground adequately social class and the importance of social class. There was a feeling that maybe the processes of racism weren't adequately addressed within their study. And also there was a presumption that everybody was working toward the same sort of housing ideal, when actually there might be a diversity of preferences about where people might want to end up, if you like, in terms of ideal housing situations. But despite those criticisms, I think three key contributions of Wrexham, which stayed with the discussion and debate over the next sort of 30, 40 years, it placed the struggle for scarce resources, and particularly housing resources, at the centre of the social and spatial dynamics of cities within the UK context. It provided an enduring model for understanding minority ethnic housing choices and outcomes, which is kind of encapsulated in the idea of constrained choices. And it prompted systematic analysis of racial inequalities by quite a large cohort of academics and others who started using similar kind of methods, approaches, ideas and concepts to explore issues and challenges in other aspects and fields of the housing system. So what we got from that emerging, as David has already alluded to, is quite an extensive evidence base accumulating. And these are just three bibliographies or evidence reviews that emerged over a period of time. The Harrison and Phillips one is worth pointing out because it's actually commissioned by the Whitehall department responsible for housing, which was then called Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. So it just shows you how sort of central within government discussion and debate the issue of minority ethnic housing experiences were. And the evidence base was critical in generating a lot of the understanding that was then filtering into policy and practice discussion and debate locally and nationally. What also emerged, and I've got a quote here from Deborah Phillips from an article she wrote in a collected volume in Ethnic and Racial Studies, reflecting on Wrexham Moor, sort of 50 years after they'd done their field work. What we also got was a sense of progress around policy and practice and regulation seeking to promote greater equality. So as she states here, we had a succession of race relation acts. We had over a decade of state-sponsored multiculturalism, particularly under the Blair-Brown New Labour government. We had programs of urban renewal and minority ethnic empowerment through BME-led housing associations. which was supported by the Housing Corporation, the now defunct regulator and funder of social housing. And all of that served to widen Black and minority ethnic access to good housing, opened up more desirable residential areas, and helped erode, not eradicate, but helped erode deep race deprivation of the 1960s. So the diagram on the right just encapsulates that kind of progress from what Rex and Moore were talking about in terms of the situations of the households they were talking to, immigrant households they were talking to, and this sense that there's a gradual sort of progressive convergence and a slow march to equality within the context of a liberal welfare state, and as a consequence, improved opportunities and outcomes. That's the sense of what was happening, if you like, on that move from the long march out of the 1960s. And so what we had, I would argue, is we had a framework that was promoting understanding of what both the situations and experiences were, but also what the drivers of those situations and experiences were, and attempts to respond to that insight and knowledge by seeking to regulate so that key stakeholders, particularly housing associations and local authorities, were required to recognise and respond to disadvantage and seek to challenge it. Again, I have to caveat all of this by saying it wasn't necessarily wholly successful, but the point is there was a framework and there was endeavour in this direction, I think. There was a set of targeted interventions that were spotlighting particular key deficits and seeking to promote greater opportunity and equality. And I would say the registration of BME-led housing associations and the active support of that by the Housing Corporation would be one example of a kind of targeted intervention. But there was also a mainstreaming of the equalities agenda within housing policy and practice, nationally and locally. So that's a summary of what I think we gained through this time period and what the kind of practices, understandings and practices that were at the forefront of popular and political debate around housing inequalities and attempts to respond to that. I'm now going to talk a bit about the last 20 or so years and how I think there's something of a fracture with that previous paradigm, and there's been something of a shift. Now I'm going to argue that inequalities remain a distinct feature, but they're increasingly invisible, and research and analysis and policy and practice are increasingly silent on these inequalities. And I'll sort of reflect a little bit about why, and then I'll sort of address that kind of final question, is there a faltering progress therefore to greater equality? And I'll probably leave that posed as a question because we're doing some research now which will hopefully sort of cast some light on that, but I'm not in a position necessarily to answer it. So it's a bit more speculative, this part of the presentation, but stay with me and see if it makes sense. So going back to the article Deborah Phillips I quoted before, Deborah makes a couple of points. Having pointed out the kind of advancements that have been made, she says, yeah, but hold on a minute. The idea that housing is a key area of contestation around immigration remains. Immigration remains politically contentious in the UK context. There's very heavily politicised debates about immigrants' housing and welfare entitlements. And those are actually quite key in the activism and the extent to which the far right gained traction, particularly in local elections. Housing is often at the forefront of those discussions and debates, just like Rex and Moore talked about in the 1960s. And then secondly, although there's been progress, there are still underpinning inequalities and systemic failures within the housing system, which result in differential experiences and opportunities based on race or ethnicity. That's the point Deborah makes, and I would very much agree with that. And I'm not going to go through these slides in any detail, and I will send my slides on so you can have a look, but I just wanted to, rather than saying there remain entrenched ethnic inequalities, I thought I should at least provide a little bit of evidence. So it's a struggle to find any, which is a key point, which I'll come back to. But it's just to kind of bring this to life a little bit and make a few points. So this is something from Nisa Finney, is somebody who's continues to do really good sort of radical statistic work looking at this issue. And she's done a number of papers profiling issues of housing disadvantage on the basis of ethnicity. This is just making the point that overcrowding is a far more common experience amongst minority ethnic groups than the white British population across all types of localities. So this was geographically differentiated analysis looking at different ethnic group experiences of overcrowding in different kinds of place within the UK context. So overcrowding is far more common and remains far more common. If you look at the tenure profile, incredibly distinct and different tenure profiles. So the top red circle you can see there is just looking at ethnicity and owner occupation. And you can see amongst the white population, 66% are homeowners. You look at, say, Bangladeshi population, 44%, huge differences. And these are even more stark if you look at the bottom, you can see the contrast between UK born and non-UK born UK residents. So 68% of UK born residents are owner occupiers, only 45% of non-UK born. So huge tenure differences, which are kind of signal some of these differential opportunities and experiences and cannot solely be put down to choice. Place of residence, which Alex touched on in terms of an important issue around allocations and opportunities. People from ethnic minorities are far more likely than the white British population to live in the most deprived neighbourhoods in England. And so the white British population, 8.6% live in the most deprived neighbourhoods. And you can see the figures on the right-hand side for different populations. 27.9% of Bangladeshi households live in the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods. So you can see again, there's a spatial dynamic to this. And I'll skip that page because I think I've made the point enough that these ethnic inequalities remain entrenched and are present. The point I want to reflect on a little bit more is why are these inequalities seemingly invisible? And so I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that invisibility and why that might be with the rest of the talk. So first of all, they're actually difficult to unpick because in sharp contrast to the previous paradigm that I've outlined, there's not a lot of attention being paid to these issues, and there's not a lot of evidence accruing. Now, it is correct that there's an ethnic question in the census, so that's one database. There are some other databases that one can tap into, but in terms of the interest and engagement of policy and practice with these issues and the generation of an evidence base associated with that, there's a real scarcity of evidence compared to the previous paradigm. I mean, previously the Housing Corporation, I don't know if Alex did work for them around these issues. I did some work for them around who was, public investment into development of new housing. The Housing Corporation asked the question, well, who receives the benefits of these new developments of housing association properties? Who moves in? And they asked me to do some analysis of first tenants moving in and seeing whether or not that was reflective of the ethnic profile of need in that local area. None of those kind of studies are undertaken anymore by social housing regulators. There's no kind of interest in those questions. So whereas once there was a wealth of research, there's a relative dearth now of up-to-date studies. And I think that's not debatable. I think that is fact. And it can be argued, I think, that whereas once policy and practice was challenged to recognise and respond to inequalities, then now those issues seem to be increasingly marginalised in policy and practice debates. So I just want to sort of finish by reflecting a little bit about why that might be. And I'm not saying this is kind of all-encompassing, but these are my sort of emerging thoughts on this. And these are overlapping and interrelated, but I'll separate them out and talk about them distinctly. So I think something around the end of multiculturalism and a shift away from that kind of understanding and agenda. There's something about the way in which the notion of the housing crisis is constructed and what it rules in and what it rules out as kind of pressing issues to be addressed. And then there's a subtle sort of elision of migration and ethnicity to the extent that we don't talk about minority ethnic, we talk about migrant and recent migrant, which denies us people who are third, fourth, fifth generation UK citizens who are minority ethnic. All within the context of the shift to a more increasingly neoliberal state. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these three to finish off. So I'm sure people on the call are very familiar what we mean when we say multiculturalism. I think it's fair to say that since the sort of late 1990s, there's been very much a shift away from a philosophy that accepts plurality and celebrates diversity to one which is problematizing diversity. And problematizing norms and values and practices which are associated with particular groups who are seen to be segregating, and the presumption is they're self-segregating within this kind of new politics of community, self-segregating, not rubbing shoulders with other sections of society, and therefore not being inculcated with the values, practices, norms and standards of Britishness. That's the narrative, which undermines civil society. That narrative gained particular traction with the idea of community cohesion, but you see it rolled out in various forms and around various kind of contemporary issues. But that's a real dramatic shift away from the multiculturalism, celebration of diversity, to a problematizing of diversity and a focus on the need for people to assimilate into some often undefined notion of Britishness. Shared values, common bonds promoted through social contacts. So it problematizes difference, it problematizes people who live in distinct neighborhoods which are deemed to be self-segregating neighborhoods. So it's a kind of ghettoization myth, if you like. So difference is rendered problematic and differential experiences are kind of individualized as choice, and you're choosing to be distinct and different and outside of British norms and standards. And this became particularly entrenched after the riots in Bradford, Burnley and Oldham in the early 2000s. And that's very much when the community cohesion agenda became entrenched. My favorite anecdote about the whole issue was that the civil service in Whitehall couldn't remember these obscure northern towns and cities, so they had to use the acronym BOB to remind themselves what the places were: Bradford, Burnley and Oldham. I speak as a born and raised in Bradford, so it's grated somewhat that they couldn't remember the 5th biggest city in the country. But anyway, that's another point. Secondly, the subtle elision of migration and ethnicity. So increasingly, there's been a sort of noisy public sort of race talk, which has cast the migrant as the contemporary folk devil. And what I would suggest is that increasingly the focus of policy and practice, discussion and debate has been on migration and migrants, and neglecting to recognise that actually the majority of the minority ethnic population in England is long-standing and established and is, like I say, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation. And so there's, we get back to some of the debates that we saw in Wrexham Moor here with the kind of problem of migrant segregation, which is sort of peddled as a concern, and the supposed failure of the state to protect British citizens from migrants who are, skilled players of the generosity of the welfare state and such like. These arguments gained real traction. And so you got moves which actually sought to actively promote what previously had been deemed discriminatory practices. Alex talked about the residency test. That was outlawed during the 90s after quite a lot of campaigning through academic research, but also sort of activism as a racist policy, but then was actually formally reintroduced to limit access for migrants to social housing. So there's a blurring of the lines between new migrants and long-standing minority ethnic populations. And as a consequence, there's an obscuring of the situations and experiences of both new migrants and long-standing minority ethnic communities, because it's not about their needs or the challenges they encounter. It's about them sort of exploiting the generosity of opportunity within the housing system. And so we have to limit their rights. That's the kind of, I'm slightly caricaturing, but that's the kind of argument I would suggest has underpinned some of the moves around overt discrimination. And then finally, the housing crisis in its construction. It's very much been constructed as a problem of access to home ownership. And that notion of the problem of access to home ownership is very much centered on there's not enough housing to go around. Well, why isn't there enough housing to go around? Well, it might be a problem of supply, but it's also a problem of demand. And critical to the debate around demand, certainly in political circles, has been migration. And the idea that migration has driven the housing crisis through a dramatic increase in demand, but also suppressing wage levels. And that feeds into this notion of the housing crisis only being about supply and demand. And of course, there's a kind of amnesia associated with this, because it ignores the long view that where we are now is we've been on this path for many, many years around, policies and practices and developments over the last 30 years have led us to where we are now. This is very much a kind of an immediate retreat into the present kind of argument about the housing crisis. So you can see, I mean, some of these are quite old, but it just gives you a flavor about the constant narrative in the popular debate linking the notion of the housing crisis and migration. And so there's a selection of mainstream newspapers, right of centre newspapers in the UK, talking about migration sparking the housing crisis, migrants accounting for half of all new homes needing to be built, migrants snatched our homes. These are repeated kind of stories within the mainstream media, which fed this notion that large-scale migration plus competition for a scarce resource, there is a supply problem, degradation of working class housing options and outcomes, driving up rents in the private sector, driving up house prices, and the notion that these people are game playing the social rented allocation process and gaining access ahead of UK citizens. What was, just as an interesting sort of aside on this, what was really interesting, I did some work looking at access to social housing by ethnic profile. And what was really interesting in some of the areas where the debates were most vehement and politically charged, particularly East London, what the data revealed was that large numbers of minority ethnic households were getting access to council housing, but very few of them were new migrants. But the local narrative was that they must be new migrants because the national narrative tells us that they are. And also that often the new migrants are moving into formerly social housing stock that have been sold through Right to Buy and now as private rented. So they weren't getting access to social housing when they were new migrants. But the local narrative was very entrenched. So a quote here from Harris Beeder, just to sum up on all of this. So the sort of present-centered representation of a migrant-induced housing crisis not only invisibilizes the social plight of racialized groups, but also there's a shared reality across ethnicities, which is being denied in all of this. So I've nearly finished, just to reassure. So I'm saying that essentially there's been a shift. There's been a shift in the debate. There's been a shift in the research engagement with these issues and understanding, but there's also been a policy shift, a shift from an attempt to challenge discrimination and racism toward a more sort of disinterest in challenging discrimination and racism, and a problematizing of migration as well. And an emphasis increasingly within the context of the increasingly neoliberal state around individual responsibility and freedom. So stepping back from looking at structural institutional processes and mechanisms, and a focus increasingly back on the choice argument within reflections on differential housing outcomes. I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is just a slide I generated previously, which is looking at some of the practices that were prevailed within the housing domain in the sort of tradition, the paradigm that I'd outlined from the 60s to the 2000s. And then the second column is looking at some of the practices which maybe have come to the fore and replaced these practices. And you can see a shift from kind of multicultural kind of emphasis to the new politics of community and assimilation. So some of this is about knowledge and awareness. So for example, nearly every local authority wasn't required to, but undertook a housing needs survey which had a BME element, either discrete or within its housing needs survey. It would look at BME housing needs in the local area. Now local authorities are required to do a market assessment, and looking at market assessments, there's virtually no attention to ethnic diversity within them. That's just one illustration of how the intelligence, understanding and emphasis has kind of switched, if you like. So I think there's a key question posed by this about, has the framework that was in place for understanding and responding to ethnic inequalities been dismantled? In the contemporary context, what efforts have been made to understand situations and outcomes? Are we still regulating to recognize and respond? Do stakeholders in the housing system have those responsibilities anymore? Or have they either been removed through deregulation, or is it deregulation through a lack of implementation that's taken place here? Is policy and practice actively targeting interventions to tackle key deficits in the way that it used to? Is the equalities agenda still mainstreamed within housing policy? I think those are key questions that aren't being asked, and by virtue of the argument that I put forward, should be asked. And that's the project that we're now undertaking. So really, the whole talk's been a justification for a piece of work that we've recently started, and I'd be very happy to come back and talk about the findings at a future date. So we're undertaking an analysis which is seeking to address these three aims. So what data is available and is being generated, and what does it tell us? To what extent is there attention to ethnic inequalities within housing policy and practice, and what kind of institutional practices are currently in play to try and both mitigate, and to what extent through lack of knowledge, understanding or reflection might be exacerbating ethnic inequalities. So those are the objectives of the research that we're we're working on at the moment. We're comparing England, Scotland and Wales because we think there might be some divergence. And we're looking at two particular case studies. We're looking at the social regulation, the regulation of social housing, to see to what extent the regulatory frame attends to issues of ethnic inequalities and requirements in terms of analysis and practice. And we're also looking at, in terms of mainstream of equalities, the Help to Buy programme, which is one of the largest, in terms of financial input, largest housing policy interventions over the last 10 years, with more than £20 billion put into it. Is there any attention in that policy to who benefits from the policy and to its potential to tackle ethnic inequalities in the housing system? So that's what our current project is exploring, and I'm going to pause there and stop sharing my screen and say thank you very much, and I hope I haven't overrun too much.
Many thanks indeed for this very thorough and fascinating presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions again. And so with no further delay, we shall move on to the third presentation by David. So do you want me to open your PowerPoint presentation, or do you want to attempt to? Yep.
Yes, please, Vincent. Yes, please.
I'll try to share my screen.
I'll be in charge of the of my PowerPoint. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a great honor, David. Okay, so I've got to well, I had it earlier, so I should be able to find it. Here we are. Right. So just allow me to share my screen now. Do you all have it?
Yes, we do.
Good, fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincent. So as you can see, in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to focus on one specificity of the UK housing system, the existence of a BME housing subsector, or BME housing associations, which I think, seen from a French perspective, from a French Republican and assimilationist perspective, is fascinating, is really striking. So in my presentation, I would like to chart the evolution of a subsector briefly, obviously, and ask why it emerged, what it has achieved. And broadly speaking, I will be looking at it from a public policy perspective, trying to understand, as I said, why the subsector emerged, what resources it has, how successive governments have reacted to it, and how housing policy has impacted on the sector. So next slide, please.
Hopefully this is going to work. Sorry, it's disappeared. Sorry, can you see it now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so I've got to. Seems to be complicated. I'm sorry. Okay.
Shall I try and share it with the rest of you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll try. Sorry. I'll try again.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's
It
working.
works. That would be
In that
better.
case, I'll try to operate it myself.
Okay. Good.
So the presentation is based on a piece of research carried out in 2015, not published yet, with a view to, at the time, studying the degree of inclusion of BME housing associations in the governance of housing in London at the time. By BME housing associations, I mean the housing associations that choose to define themselves as such, and no longer the housing associations with a high proportion of BME tenants and a high proportion of board directors, which used to be the definition used in the past. And I will also use the term BME, not BAME, because this is the one used by the sector itself. So my approach is a qualitative one. In 2015, I conducted, as you can see, a number of interviews, semi-structured interviews in London at the time, with chief executives of various BME housing associations, former chairs or founders of various BME campaign organizations in the field of housing, former members of the London branch of the Housing Corporation, and as well as various cabinet members and chairs of housing committees at the GLA and borough levels. And obviously I also drew at the time on a number of academic articles, books, official reports, and grey literature. And this year, for the purpose of this presentation, I updated the research and I carried out some new interviews, and I broadened the scope of the research beyond London to some English regions. And I focused on, in particular, two organizations, BME National, and which is the Federation of BME Housing Associations, and its London branch, BME London. So I carried out another 4 semi-structured interviews of BME national executives, who are also chief executives of local BME housing associations. And I also interviewed members of BME London to measure the evolution of the sector since 2015. And again, I consulted a number of primary and secondary documents. So I'll move on to the next slide. So the first question I tried to answer, and the first questions I should say, I tried to answer were, why did the BME housing sector emerge and when? And what the interviews showed was that, broadly speaking, before the 1980s, there were very few BME housing associations. There were a number of associations created from the 1950s onwards to address the needs of BME people, but they were not managed by BME people. And according to my interviewees, there were only 5 BME housing associations by 1983, so a very small number, 2 in London, 1 in Birmingham, 1 in Leeds, and 1 in Reading. And they often catered for what is called special needs, not general needs. For instance, they would cater for the needs of elderly people, BME elderly people, or young homeless BME men, in particular young offenders. That's something that kept coming back. What the interviews also revealed was that during the late 1970s and early 1980s, as David explained, the housing needs of BME people became the object of public policy as a result of a combination of structural and agency factors. And I'd like to focus on these factors now. So the former, the structural factors, in my opinion, include something I mentioned before, the creation of a Commission for Racial Equality and the publication of its reports, but also something that was mentioned before, the widening of the remit of the Housing Corporation that was originally founded in the 1960s to fund and help housing cooperatives, but that was given a wider remit from the mid-1970s onwards, and that started funding and subsidizing BME housing associations. And what's something also my interviewees underlined was that from 1979, approximately 1979 onwards, there were debates among the Housing Corporation's board members about how to support existing BME housing associations. And they also underline, those interviewees, that the early 1980s riots and the publication of a Scarman report marked a turning point in the way BME housing associations were regarded, in particular by the Housing Corporation. Agency factors that explain the emergence of the BME subsector include the rise of various Black activists in the housing field, as well as the emergence in 1983 of a powerful and vocal new actor called the Federation of Black Housing Organizations. You have it on the slide, it's FBHO. And FBHO formed very close links with the Housing Corporation, as well as with the National Housing Federation. And this contributed to the emergence of a policy network from the early 1980s onwards. And through, as again the interviews show, through lobbying and advocacy, FBHO managed to make race move up the national policy agenda, in particular within the Housing Corporation, so the organization in charge of funding the voluntary sector. And the perfect example of its influence was the program Mapping Black Britain that was developed by the Housing Corporation in 2 phases. From 1986 to 1991, the Housing Corporation focused on creating new BME housing associations. And to do so, it set aside 10% of its budget and encouraged also mainstream housing associations to build 4 BME housing associations, the newly created ones in particular. The empowerment of the Black community was a key objective behind this Mapping Black Britain program. And you have on the slide a number of 2 quotes from some of my interviewees emphasizing this, this priority. One reads, it was about recognizing the right of BME housing associations to meet the needs of their own communities. And the other one, as you can see, but it's probably hidden by the screens. The real purpose was to get BME people in a position of power and to enable them to have a stake. And as a result of this program, approximately 40 new BME housing associations were set up in the 1980s. And empowerment also meant training BME people to take up positions, in particular management positions, in not just the newly created BME housing associations, but in the mainstream housing social sector. A second phase of the program opened in 1991 until approximately 1996. And during that phase, the Housing Corporation's objectives shifted to strengthening existing BME housing associations by injecting millions of pounds and even asking non-BME housing associations to transfer some of their stock to those newly created BME housing associations in exchange for subsidies by the Housing Corporation. And so the result of this approximately 10-year-long program was that by the late 1990s, there were about 200 BME housing associations. So that was really the apex of and the heydays of the sector. At the local level, what the again interviewees explained was that in London in particular, BME housing associations became included in the governance of housing, and in some boroughs, like for instance Hackney and Lambeth, the authorities embarked on unofficial positive discrimination policies in order to strengthen those BME housing associations. And I can provide examples later on. One good example was the decision by the authorities, local authorities, to channel BME applicants towards those newly created BME housing associations. At the GLC level, before it was abolished, support was also forthcoming. There were subsidies granted, for instance, to FBHO. Again, FBHO was included in the policy-making process, and this close relationship actually survived the demise of the GLC, as the interviewees explained. What the interviews also showed was that a second stage started in the late 1990s, a second stage in the life of this BME housing subsector. Why? Because gradually BME housing associations became sidelined and often removed from the national and local governance of housing. And my initial reaction was that this was due to a broader change in race relations policy, as David alluded to. Because I thought that following the London bomb attacks in particular, and following the change in the official rhetoric from fighting against discrimination and fighting for multiculturalism, and following the shift to community cohesion and integration, I thought that this had influenced to a large extent and the way the sector was regarded by the authorities. But the interviews showed that this was slightly more complicated, and again that there were structural and agency factors behind the decline of the subsector. So structural factors include something I think that was mentioned by Alex, a number of shifts in the housing corporation's policies and objectives regarding the BME sector, in keeping with a broader change in the housing corporation's role at the national level. What happened was that the BME housing associations came under investigation in terms of costs, efficiency, and value for money. There was a growing feeling in the housing corporation, there's a quote I think that illustrates this, that they had grown too quickly and didn't have the skills and management of the right management organization. This impression on the part of the housing corporation was compounded by a number of reports published in the early 2000s that highlighted in particular that the BME sector accommodated a very small percentage of the BME population. In other words, that despite the housing corporation efforts and programs, most BME people were still accommodated by mainstream housing associations. And according to a lot of interviewees, this was really this marked the decline, the beginning of the decline of the subsector. A number also other factors, other drivers include the fact that a number of BME housing associations collapsed because they were not financially viable. There was a number of court cases following allegations of positive discrimination, and as a result of that, the housing corporation abandoned its support in favor of the housing of the BME subsector and turned its attention to the whole housing association sector, or not-for-profit sector. And the not-for-profit sector was requested to meet BME housing needs increasingly from the early 2000s. There were also changes in the funding system that can explain the decline of the sector, including the reduction of building subsidies and their termination. More recently, the reduction in rents that the housing, the not-for-profit sector was able to charge, and also the introduction after 2004 of something called preferred partners. The other structural factors also include the redefinition of priorities, funding priorities within, at the time, the approved development program, away from social housing, and increasingly, as I think Alex also mentioned, towards low-cost home ownership, something that does not fit and doesn't meet BME Housing Association needs. And there was also something Alex mentioned, change in the allocation procedure in favor of choice-based lettings, which made it impossible for local councils to pair applicants with BME housing associations. Agency factors, they include, they also explain the decline of the sector, and they include at the national level the dissolution and the disappearance of a federation of Black housing organizations in 2008 that collapsed because for financial reasons, but also because, according to some of my interviewees, they could not properly influence the housing corporation and felt that their influence had come to an end. And the same year, there was also the abolition of the housing corporation in 2008. At the local level, what the interviews highlighted was that the creation of the mayor's office in London and the gradual transfer of strategic and funding powers to the mayor after 1997 have made it possible for successive mayors to make different governance choices and policy choices. And what the interviewees often underlined was that under Ken Livingstone, all BME housing associations were strongly supported, and that there was a clear desire on the part of the Livingstone administration to include BME housing associations in the governance of housing at the GLC level. There were a number of committees set up, race advisors appointed, regular meetings, etc. And a percentage also of newly built social homes were to go to the BME housing sector. By contrast, under Boris Johnson, what they also explained was that the housing policy became increasingly colorblind. Some committees were dismantled, consultation with the BME subsector declined. There was a feeling among the sector that they were no longer listened to, and money was no longer forthcoming because those BME housing associations were seen as too small to make a difference to the housing crisis in London. So they became increasingly sidelined. So the consequence of this decline was that, and of all these drivers, was that the number of BME housing associations shrunk because many associations merged with very often non-BME housing associations because they were no longer financially viable. And as a result of these mergings and of this decline, they lost visibility and influence at the national and local level. So what's the situation today? Well, the subsector is a much smaller sector in size than it used to be in the 1990s. Today, it numbers approximately 70 associations, nationally speaking. By 2021, these associations manage approximately 60,000 homes, or 3% of the social housing stock, and they housed approximately 250,000 people. The sector is diverse in terms of client groups, size, and mission. And what is clear from the interviews is that there appears to be a major divide between London and the rest of the country. BME housing associations are mostly found in Greater London, 43 of them out of 70. A few are found in the West Midlands, in the East Midlands, 13, in the Northwest and in Yorkshire and Humberside, 10, and 3 in the Southwest, which means that there are none, for instance, in the Northeast of England. The interviewees also underlined that, well, they thought that the size of the BME population in London, obviously, meant that the sector was more sustainable with approximately 20,000 homes. What was interesting also to hear is that the degree of inclusion in the local governance of housing varies a lot. In London, at the GLA level, as I will explain in greater detail later on, collaboration has been revived and a close relationship has developed following the election of Sadiq Khan. However, what many interviewees underline, and that was paradoxical, is that at borough level, or they said the flip side of a coin is that many BME housing associations are just seen as another housing association because they are too small to make a difference to the local, to the borough's housing needs. And so they are often ignored. There are no communication channels, specific communication channels between boroughs and the subsector. In the regions, at council level and at combined authority level, in particular in Greater Manchester in the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, it appears that that BME housing associations are seen as key actors and are strongly supported, and they always have a direct line to the local authority. Although, and that's a big difference with the situation in Greater London, local financial resources are very limited because of the combined authority deals introduced by the coalition government. So as a result of all these factors mentioned previously, most BME housing associations have ceased building and they have sought other means of expanding their housing stock. Some of them, for instance, buy property on the open market. Others buy empty properties from the local council, or they buy properties by other housing associations that want to transfer some of their stock. And what's also striking is that many have diversified their activities. They're not just landlords anymore, but they are increasingly social businesses, which was already the case for some of them. Some of them were founded, created with a specific purpose that was often to help the local community, not just regarding housing, for instance, regarding care services. So many provide today care and support services to their local BME community. For instance, some offer programs to prevent youth crime. A lot of them provide resettlement services to migrants. Others, legal services, health awareness and well-being programs. And again, a lot of them offer employment support. To try and overcome this decline, what the interviews also revealed was that a number of, two new structures have been created. One in 2009 called BME National, created to represent and promote the sector and collaborate with the National Housing Federation in order to influence policymakers and also to advertise the needs of BME people and increase their representation at management level in the wider not-for-profit sector. And in 2016, the London arm of BME National was created and was set up by 12 housing associations in London. So today there is an organization called BME London that has the same, more or less the same mission and pledges as the BME national structure. In London, there have been positive outcomes following the election of Sadiq Khan and the lobbying of BME London. In particular, the organization is recognized again as a voice of the BME community in London, and it sits on a number of GLA housing structures. new funding rules have been published by the GLA, and a new partnership is being set up to help the sector expand again in London. For instance, the largest housing associations in London, called the G15 group, are committed to improve the representation, to increase the representation of BME managers on their boards. So, to conclude on these on the evolution of the sector, on these interviews, the evolution of the sector has actually confirmed, surprisingly, one of the three scenarios identified in the 2004 Housing Corporation report about the future of the sector, which is the least ambitious one and the most pessimistic one at the time. The gradual sidelining of the sector and the lack of support at national level for the sector. My impression is also that the sector finds itself at a crossroads. On the one hand, many interviewees feel that the sector has gone backwards and that national policy has gone backwards with, as we said before, and as David explained, the quasi-disappearance, for instance, of BME people in leadership position in the voluntary sector, the decline of the issue of race equality within the general housing policy. So most CEs of BME housing associations are disappointed with post-2010 government housing choices, and they feel that race equality, as I said, has moved down the agenda in favor of all forms of equality. On the other hand, they feel that the sector has benefited from the Black Lives Matter movement. This has, they said, renewed the attention given to the BME housing sector, and this has led to a number of initiatives, for instance, by the National Housing Federation, to start a conversation, a national conversation, to again try and understand what's wrong with the organizational culture of the mainstream not-for-profit sector, and try to again increase the proportion of BME people in management positions in the mainstream sector. So my impression is that, as I said, the sector is at a crossroads, and despite the pessimism expressed by some of the, by many actually of the chief executives I interviewed, my impression is that the sector is struggling, but determined to carry on with its mission, which it sees as meeting the needs of BME people in a more responsive way than the mainstream not-for-profit sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to the three of you. Three great talks, great panel, very solid. Excellent, thank you. Are there any questions? I, for one, have lots of questions, so I'm putting my hand up, but I think Sonia Awan has a question. Go ahead, Sonia. You need to turn your mic on, Sonia, we can't hear you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this really engaging discussion around housing of ethnic minorities in Britain. It is generally believed that to change the system, one must be part of that system. And we know that BME political representation is on the rise. But what we witness is that in Britain's most deprived neighborhoods, which are also the most diverse ones, like the East End, health and housing are still major issues. Dr. Alex Marsh just mentioned that social security benefits are getting less generous, and as David Robinson showed, housing is still a key area of conflict and contention in Britain. So my question is for Professor David Fee. So in your presentation, you just mentioned that in the 1990s, there were attempts to place BME people in positions of power within BME housing associations. And that following the election of Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London, BME associations gained in visibility and influence probably. So if BME associations have a direct line to their local authorities, do you think that they have a direct line to their elected BME politicians as well? And more specifically, does seeing and having BME politicians change the way the housing problem is framed and tackled at the national and local levels? Thank you.
Well, what the interviews showed was that there was a, but as I said, the situation varied a lot from one borough to another, and from the GLA level to the borough level. What the interviewees explained was that what made a difference to the way BME housing associations, how shall I put it, to the link they had with to the local authorities, was the size of the BME population, local BME population, as well as the how shall I put it, the way the organizations are structured locally. So, for instance, when you have a number of active BME housing associations that are determined to get that message across to the local authorities, that makes a major difference to the way the BME local needs are met and seen by the local authorities. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. They didn't really mention the importance of local BME politicians. What's clear with Sadiq Khan and with Kane Livingstone is that there's a clear desire to, as I said, include BME housing associations in the governance of housing through a number of committees, regular meetings, specific grants, even at the moment, with Sadiq Khan being provided to build more BME homes. But there was in the interviews no mentioning of the influence of politicians or MPs on the way the BME sector is able to make itself heard. I'm not sure I answered the question very clearly. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vincent, go ahead if you want.
No, you may. I mean, you raised your hand before I did. So go ahead. And I'll ask my question after.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm going to try to formulate this as clearly as possible, but I'm not sure I have very clear ideas. I'm trying to make a link between the presentation by David and the presentation by Alex. Something that you said, David, was that in your example of the East End, that people think that it's new migrants who are taking up accommodation, whereas in fact it's older established sort of third or fourth generation migrants, so not really migrants anymore, ethnic minorities perhaps. And I thought that was very interesting, and it made me think of another point that Alex made, which is that one of the more recent requirements that have been introduced that you've been analyzing is the requirement for residency for a certain number of years to access housing, 3 or 4 or 5 years, I think you said, according to local cases. So, and you said that could be viewed as either more or less inclusive or exclusive of minorities, but definitely it sounds like it's exclusive of new migrants. That's for sure. If you're a Polish worker coming into Britain, you cannot by definition have resided in the local area. So that would explain then why it's actually the housing system now is tilted in favor of more established immigrant communities of immigrant descent for several generations against the actual migrants. Does that make sense? Or is that actually something that you notice, or is that very marginal?
I'll maybe say something, Alex, and you can come in afterwards if that's okay. I think there's in terms of social housing allocations and the local residency test. I think absolutely the key group that are disadvantaged by that requirement to have been resident locally for a certain number of years are new migrants, but not necessarily just new migrants, because recent migrants, whatever we might call those, people who might have been in the UK 10 years, might have more tendency to move geographically for work, for example, and such like. That might be a trend. So I think in relation to social housing, your point rings true, although there might be some caveats. I think the other thing I would emphasize is the point Alex made, which is particularly relevant to the private renter sector, which is the right to rent. So one of the analysis suggests that the right to rent, this is the obligation of the landlord to ensure that the person they're renting to has the right to be in the UK. And you can, it's an offence to rent to people who don't have the right. The easiest way for a landlord to not get into any complications is to avoid renting to anybody from a minority ethnic group. You don't have to engage with that conversation if you're renting to a white British person. That's the real risk there, and there is suggestion that's how that right to rent is played out. That still remains discriminatory across the minority ethnic population. I'll pause and you can come in and nuance any of that, Alex.
No, I agree, and I certainly agree with the idea that sort of migrants and established minority communities have been conflated, and with the emphasis on migrants allowing. I mean, I do think that if we unpick that a bit more, the idea that second or third or fourth generation aren't migrants, in a certain sorts of populist discourse, we'll run into trouble when we have the sort of, if you're talking to communities, you'll get people saying, well, actually, it doesn't matter they've been here for 50 years, we still don't consider them to be authentically British, whatever that means, So I think there is it's a bit blurrier for some segments of the community, if you like, on the sort of populist end of things.
Agreed.
They're all migrants since the Norman Conquest, I think. So there's that element. I mean, just to go back to the previous question, the other thing, which I think links to what David Fee was saying to David Robinson, about regulation and actually links to mine. So this thing about representation is a really interesting one, because if you look now for mainstream housing associations, and if they're trying to recruit board members, they invariably are genuinely looking for greater diversity. I think they're advertising for people interested for people from minority communities, but the challenge is they run up, and it's not about minority ethnic communities simply, it's also about getting residents on the board and various other things. They run up against a regulatory structure which says the board has to have a certain skill set. You're much more likely to recruit a retired management accountant or a management consultant or a solicitor onto the board, because the board has to demonstrate, partly to satisfy the funders and the regulator, a set of skills. And there's something in there about representation. So there's a desire on the one hand to say, well, we need to speak more for the community. On the other hand, our governance regulatory rating will be downgraded if we can't demonstrate a particular mix of skills on amongst a relatively small number of people. And there's something in there. It doesn't mean to say that minority communities are excluded, but it's almost like that their professional role comes first. They have to have a set of professional skills to get onto the board, and those skills may be distributed in different ways. So you're much more likely to be a white middle-aged man who's had a professional career, you know, and end up on the board of a housing association than you are, you know, from other walks of life or other communities. So there's something in there about, if you like, the supply of people as much as the demand for people to be part of these structures, and how that intersects with the regulatory framework, which demands the ability to demonstrate certain skills. If you've borrowed, you know, £400 million, you know, you've got to be able to demonstrate you can manage it, you know, and it's that sort of, and that presents a challenge, I think, for certain sorts of representation. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was helpful. Vincent, just squeeze one last question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
I had a third one. It's about David's presentation. I thought it was very interesting. One of the points you made at the end, which was about BLA, Black Lives Matter, and you said they seem to have some kind of influence. And I wanted to ask all the panelists, including yourself, do you think that BLA is actually something that has an observable impact on the various aspects of the housing system that you're studying? Because in the US, it seems to have started a big national discussion over a variety of policy sectors. What about the UK? Is there a kind of revival of the anti-racism that David documented in the history of British politics from the 60s to the 60s to the 90s, maybe? Or is that marginal? Or should we be careful not to over exaggerate the impact of things like I'm curious about knowing more about that.
Yeah. If I may go first, because I'm sorry, I've got as I said in the chat, a master's dissertation either. What the interview showed was that the BLM movement
BLM, yes,
revive an interest in increase the interest in the BME housing subsector, but a lot of the chief executives thought that this hadn't really translated, into real something. I mean, real or tangible effects or changes. I gave an illustration, an example of the one effect of a movement, which is this new conversation in the National Housing Federation to try and understand why there are so few BME people at management positions, and to try and do something about it. So they think that this could be just a blip, as it happened before, and that the main problem is that as I think David said, they're up against, at the national level, a policy that is not at all conducive to the development of the revival of the movement of the BME housing subsector. And I have to go. I'm sorry. I really have to go.
Okay. Thanks a lot, David. That was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you very much again to David and Alex for joining us on this webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, David.
Bye.
I just add to what David has said. I'm not seeing a notable shift. I mean, I think because I don't think the developments in relation to Black Lives Matter are necessarily going to generate what I would suggest needs to be a paradigm shift if we're going to see the changes in policy and practice that were hinted at in the question. I think also in the English context, one can also bring into the discussion the Grenfell fire, and which that was a block of flats which had a very diverse population within it. of largely relatively poor, deprived households in a relatively poor, well, actually in a really interesting part of London, which is very wealthy as well as very poor, living cheek by jowl with each other. But that issue and the associated issues around lack of regulation and the poor quality of housing that people are living in, you thought might, together with Black Lives Matter, you thought might gain some traction, but I'm not aware of it doing so, principally for the point David made. I think the national discussion, the popular and political discussion and debate nationally is not really engaging with those issues. And I'm not aware of any notable shift. And it's interesting, where will the debate go? I mean, just as an aside, the Sheffield City Council recently undertook a race equality commission, which was in some ways harking back to the kinds of discussion and debate at the local level that might have taken place 20, 30 years ago in terms of its remit and emphasis. It's quite strikingly, housing was not one of the themes that it explored, which in the context of post-Grenfell housing policy was just bizarre, but it never entered their heads that housing might be part of the agenda they were looking at. Crime, education, deprivation, absolutely. Policing, yes, but housing was not part of the discussion. That shows you how far away housing is now from being seen as central to the discussions around race, ethnicity, equality and discrimination in the English context at least.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to follow up on David's point there, not to elaborate too much, but I think the response to Grenfell is interesting in the sense that the government issued a green paper, it's issued a white paper, which places an emphasis on listening to the voice of tenants. So there's a governance dimension to it, but it's not recognizing the nature of the particular grouping. There's no ethnic dimension to that. It has had a sort of, it's had a significant effect on the way that housing organizations are thinking about what they should be seen to be doing with respect to their residents. But whether that makes it more sort of culturally sensitive or sort of changes strategies or feeds through, if you're genuinely listening, how does that affect things? That's not clear yet. Certainly, and I'd agree with David that the Black Lives Matter was a moment. Seems to me it's a moment in time. I'm a bit like Grenfell Tower. You at the time you'd say, is this a sort of critical juncture that's going to sort of shift us onto a different path, change it, and as it sort of recedes, but you say it doesn't seem to be at the moment. It doesn't seem to be that it has the momentum it's gathered. It sort of shifted things into a different trajectory. It doesn't seem to be that's the case.
Okay. Thank you. Vincent, I think you had more questions. Your mic is still not on.
Sorry, yeah, it's my mistake. I just couldn't. Yeah, I have. Well, I was actually. I must thank again the three speakers we had today, because it was very interesting. And actually, I had two questions, and I think I might try to combine them, if you don't mind. Well, the first question is that the three of you mentioned John Rex, and whom I read quite a lot when I was doing my PhD back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And I was wondering whether you considered that the concept of housing class kept some relevance today in the light of, what you said. That's my first question. And then my second question is that we understand, on the basis of what you've said since 10 o'clock, we understand that the overall housing picture for BME groups remains fairly bleak in the UK, and to a certain extent has deteriorated in recent years. I wanted to know whether you had any evidence at all of certain groups, certain comparatively better off communities, thinking about the Indian or the Chinese communities, for example, having taken advantage of the right to buy or of subsequent such schemes. Thanks.
Do you want me to start, Alex? And I'll leave lots of gaps and holes for you to fill. Thanks for the question. In relation to housing class, what I think there are the ongoing and entrenched distinct differences within the experiences of minority ethnic communities, and those vary between ethnicities. But what I would suggest that is maybe not fully grasped by, this was one of the criticisms, was it Peter Saunders who criticised housing classes when it first came out? I think it might have been, I don't know, Alex might correct me. You know, there's the debate between I guess, you know, the Weberians and the Marxists, wasn't it, and those kinds of agendas, but without getting into all of that, one of the questions that was posed was the extent to which it wasn't necessarily adequately foregrounding commonality of experience in relation to social class. And I think one of the things that I would argue has increasingly happened over the, say, the last 20 years is almost like the migrant experience, and the recent migrant experience I'm talking about here, was almost like a testing ground for an approach to housing provision, quite minimal basic housing provision within the private renter sector, often in shared houses, in poor conditions, which has now been played out and rolled out more broadly across a wider population who are experiencing those housing situations. It's almost like there's a convergence taking place and a shared experience between migrants and non-migrants and, you know, different ethnicities. Well, that convergence isn't progressive as it might have been from the 60s to the 2000s. It's more regressive or retrograde, if you like. So there's a kind of increasing similarity of experience, but it's by virtue of a diminishing quality for many long-standing, settled, including white British working class households in terms of the housing opportunities they have, which is squarely within the private renters sector now for the reasons and challenges of accessing social housing that Alex has outlined. And I think that the danger of housing classes is that it neglects that shared experience, which of course the whole contestation has set those groups up as being in opposition, when actually the system is failing to deliver, you know, adequate, safe, affordable, high quality accommodation for all of those groups. So that's one thought. The other thing is the importance of recognizing divergence and difference within experiences within the minority ethnic population and not treating them as a homogenous population. The Indian group's a great example of that. So most of the indices that the slides that I skipped to quite quickly, on most of those indices, the Indian population situation is actually slightly better than the white British population. But I think that's a reflection of the sort of migration pathway of people of Indian heritage into the UK. So, you know, so a lot, for example, a lot of the Pakistani population who came to the UK post that Second World War to work in heavy industry, the cotton mills, the woolen mills in the north of England, came from very, very poor parts of Pakistan. With often low levels of education and low levels of capital resource and such like. And went into manual labour jobs. So a lot of the Indian population were more middle class. And so those kind of long-standing, kind of the residue of those long-standing migration histories and traditions, I think, still feed through into some of the differentiation around different ethnic groups. So it's important not to view those groups as homogenous. I think that's certainly what I would say in response to that second point. I'll pause there and let Alex come in.
So I certainly agree with that. Second point. I mean, I don't know actually. Your point about, for example, whether whether there's any evidence on things like the differential capitalization on the right to buy over time, or I mean, in some senses, the right to buy is not quite run out of steam. But if you're in the social sector now, you're probably not in a financial position to exercise the right to buy, I guess, in many cases. So whether we went back historically and looked at the early waves and whether or not people sort of are now not in the sector and they've used, I mean, one of the things about that, I mean, is that it would be interesting actually, because we know that it's roughly 40% of right to buy sales have ended up back in the private rented sector or something like that sort of order. So the idea that was a sort of exit to home ownership is, you know, isn't sort of how it's played out over the longer term, which doesn't mean to say people aren't accumulating. But whether that would be, you know, they're not accumulating assets, they might well be accumulating assets through residential property. But I mean, that suggests the sort of housing class thing starts to look a bit different anyway. I mean, in the sense that the way in which the housing system has evolved, the private rented sector, the rise of the sort of small scale landlordism and this sort of thing, you know, people are accumulating through, but not necessarily through residence anymore. And I think that David, I hadn't thought of it the way David's just described as migrants as a testing ground for sort of downward convergence. And I think that I think that's got some mileage in it, because I think things like the gig economy and precarity and the way in which other parts of the labour market have changed, which means that parts of the white working class, or indeed sort of mobile students, have ended up in fairly precarious positions and shared accommodation and such like, because affordability is really bad in the private sector as well. I mean, that's an interesting sort of argument. I think, but it doesn't mean that housing circumstance overrides some of those sort of labour market positions and sort of social class questions as being key to understanding the commonality of experience. I mean, the experience of precarity in the labour market, the experience of precarity in housing, and how that's distributed, you know, is you know, and how it is expanding across more of the system, being driven by the sort of social class and labour market questions. My view is that sort of, certainly when housing class is sort of morphed into sort of consumption cleavages, and the idea that that's more important in understanding what's going on than what's going on in the labour market, I'm sort of skeptical, if I'm honest. Even if it had traction then, I mean, you know, the trajectory is such that it may not have traction now, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I was just, so I didn't answer the right to buy question. If you just pop in after Alex. And one of the really interesting things about right to buy and the profile of right to buy is that by virtue of the sort of discriminatory practices in housing allocations, you either had ethnic groups who were hugely underrepresented in social housing sector, so couldn't take advantage of right to buy. A prime example is the Pakistani population, whose levels of social renting have historically been incredibly low for issues of access. And then in the sort of African Caribbean population, who did access social housing in larger numbers, particularly in London, they were disproportionately allocated to the worst housing, typically high-rise blocks, which were the ones that were least attractive and least beneficial in terms of capital accumulation through right to buy as well. So the right to buy process entrenched inequalities by virtue of the way the process and who was living where, basically. So,
thank you.
Do we have any more questions, anyone?
I don't think we do, actually.
Mm-hmm. I want to say thank you very much to everybody who's been attending on this extended French weekend because of the bank holiday. It's great, and I think you were quite right to make the choice, because this particular session was actually particularly interesting.
Excellent.
So special thanks to David Fay, the organizer, and David and Alex for doing this in these conditions as well. It was great. We enjoyed it very much, and we learned a lot. Thank you.
And many thanks for making your presentations available on the blog, right? Because they would be helpful to other people. David, it doesn't look like I got your PowerPoint presentation in the chat section, actually. I didn't see it.
No, it doesn't seem to have downloaded. Maybe, is there somebody I could email it to? That might
yeah,
be...
sure. I'll send, this is just my email.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you it now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm very slow when it comes to typing. That's my email, right? So if you want to send it, I mean, I managed to get Alex's presentation earlier, so hopefully I managed to download it, and I will upload it on the we will upload it on the Medium blog. So just a very brief word about the upcoming events at MIDIB. I mean, the next one at least. So the next session will take place on the 29th of November, and everybody is welcome. It will be entitled Scotland, Immigration and Diversity, an Exception in the UK. And it will be organized by a colleague, Edwige Campietrin from Valenciennes, Professor Campietrin. And there'll be 3 participants in total. Stephen Mullen, a research associate from the University of Glasgow. Then Dr. Emilia Pitka-Nisaka, senior lecturer in sociology at the University of West of Scotland. And Edwige Compietrin, the organizer, will be doing a presentation as well, then. So thank you very much, and we do hope that we'll see you again on the 29th of November for this presentation, which will also be recorded and made available on our blog. Thanks again.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much,
Pleasure.
everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.